All right, so we have talked about a couple cycles of energy. We have talked about photosynthesis and how plants use sunlight, um, going through the process of photosynthesis and ending up with energy. We've talked about cellular respiration, where cells of all living things use that glucose and break it down into energy that they can use. And so now let's talk about some of the cycles of matter that occur in our environment. Okay, again, we know that energy moves through the ecosystem as some organisms eat others, as some organisms make their own energy. Matter also moves through the ecosystem through water, carbon, and oxygen cycles. Okay, so let's start with the water cycle. Water, of course, is essential to life. And the water cycle is just this continuous process where water is moving through or from Earth's surface to the atmosphere and back again. And it does that through the processes of evaporation, condensation, and precipitation. Let's start with evaporation. Molecules of the liquid water are being absorbed and they're changing into a gas. And this is something we have already talked about. The energy for evaporation comes from the heat of the sun. In the world water cycle, water evaporates from oceans and lakes and living things and forms water vapor, which is just a gas in our atmosphere. As that water vapor rises higher in the atmosphere, of course, it cools down. And then we know that as things cool, as that energy is being taken away from the gas, it is going to condense. It is going to turn back into a liquid. And that would be why that process is called condensation. And those water droplets collect around dust particles and they form clouds. And then as that water vapor condenses and those drops of water in the clouds grow larger, eventually at some point, the heavy drops are going to fall back to Earth, and they fall in the form of precipitation. Precipitation can be rain, snow, sleet, hail. It can fall into the ocean. It could fall into a lake. It could fall into a river. It could fall back onto the land where it's going to get soaked up into the soil and become groundwater, or possibly runoff from the land, going back into a river, a lake, or an ocean. Okay, so what about the other types of matter? What about carbon? What about oxygen? What about nitrogen? So in our ecosystems, we have producers, consumers, and decomposers. And all of those things play a role in the carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen cycles. And of course, just like water, carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen are essential building blocks. They are essential for life. And those things specifically make up proteins in our bodies. Oxygen, of course, we know is needed for cellular respiration. And so the carbon cycle, that is the process where carbon is moving between organisms and their environment. Of course, producers take in carbon dioxide during photosynthesis. They use the carbon to make food. As consumers eat those producers, they take in the carbon-containing food molecules. The consumers then break down the food to obtain energy. As that food is broken down, consumers release carbon dioxide and water back into the environment. When producers and consumers die, decomposers break down the remains and return that carbon to the soil. Some decomposers also release carbon dioxide into the air. So there is a lot going on when we're talking about carbon. Now, the process where carbon and oxygen are recycled, of course, are linked together. We know this when talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So like carbon, oxygen cycles through our ecosystem. Producers release it as part of photosynthesis. And then most organisms have to take that oxygen in from the air and water and use it to carry out their own processes. Now, human activities also affect the levels of carbon and oxygen in the atmosphere. When we burn oil and other plant-based fuels, carbon dioxide ends up being released into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide levels can also rise when we take away forests, when we clear farmland, when we burn fuel. Of course, increasing the carbon dioxide levels is a major factor in global warming. Now, the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen moves from the air into the soil, into living things, and then back into the air or the soil. We know that our air is primarily nitrogen gas with other things that are dissolved into it. But most organisms can't use free nitrogen. It has to be combined or fixed with something else. But the process of changing free nitrogen into something that is usable is called nitrogen fixation. What's nitrogen? Nitrogen fixation is performed by different kinds of bacteria. Some of these bacteria live in bumps or the roots of certain plants, and those plants are legumes, things like peas and alfalfa and peanuts. So the relationship between bacteria and the legumes would be considered a mutualistic one. Both plants and bacteria are benefiting. Bacteria feed on the plant sugars, and the plants are supplied with nitrogen in a usable form. A nice, happy little relationship. Now, once that nitrogen is fixed, producers can then use it to build proteins and other compounds. Nitrogen can cycle from the soil to producers and then consumers many, many times. At some point, though, the bacteria break down the nitrogen completely and release that free nitrogen back in the air, which of course then starts that whole cycle over again. So a system, and we've talked about systems before, is a group of parts that work together to form a function. An organism is a living system. One function of that living system is to recycle the matter and energy in an ecosystem. Living systems, of course, do this through photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Photosynthesis and cellular respiration both follow the laws of conservation of mass and energy. So we know that the total amount of matter before the reaction is going to equal the total amount of matter after the reaction. The total amount of energy before the reaction is going to equal the total amount of energy after the reaction. And of course, all of those systems help make up our biosphere, our geosphere, our hydrosphere, and our atmosphere. So again, the total amount of matter and energy on Earth remains constant. As plant and animals grow, they don't use up matter. They just transform it into other things. And then when they die, it gets returned to the atmosphere or other parts of the system. And of course, then that cycle just starts again.